Okay, so thank you all very much for being here. Really appreciate it. I am thrilled today because we have my good friend Lourdes Molina here for a reading and conversation about her book, Freeway, La Movie. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to Lourdes and then ask you to talk a little bit about the book, a little bit of a synopsis, description, that kind of thing. So Lourdes Molina, as many of you know, teaches Spanish and Spanish language and Spanish American literature at SMU. She received her PhD from UTD in 2015 with a focus in 20th century Latin American literature, Cuban studies, and literary translation. Her translation, Freeway, La Movie, was published last year in the fall with Deep Vellum Publishing. So with that, a warm welcome to Lourdes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Thank you, Professor Schulte, Center for Translation Studies, Shelby. It's always nice to be back here. So Freeway, La Movie by Jorge Enrique Lage. He's a contemporary Cuban writer who mostly writes novels and some short stories and some essays. I haven't seen any poetry yet, but he's in Cuba, unless that's changed very recently, and his work is very postmodern, a little bit of sci-fi, a little bit of cyberpunk, speculative fiction overall. And this novel in particular is about two, maybe one, we're not sure, but for the most part, two protagonists, two men who wander around the island, around Cuba, while they wander, and Cuba's in this not quite post-apocalyptic ruins, but it's in shambles for reasons that we're not really sure why this is. But they are wandering through the island and having these adventures. And all the while, there is this colossal freeway that is being built that is supposed to connect the island to the US and then cut through the Caribbean and then into the, and then meet the southern continent, South America. So, and then of course, in this process, the island, the lush tropical island, is becoming a desert, right? It's being destroyed by this construction. And then while this incredible feat of engineering is being constructed, there's also this ambiguous documentary that is being filmed. And supposedly there are cameras everywhere, but we're not really sure who's filming and why they're filming. So it's a documentary / reality TV show that sometimes follows these characters, but really the purpose is to follow to document the construction of the freeway. And so it's narrated, it's a first person narration, and the narrator is an unnamed, an anonymous narrator who guides us through this island that is no longer an island really, and many things that would be considered Cuban, right? These points of identity are ceasing to exist because of this transformation. And so that is the synopsis, and it's really a novel in stories, which in some ways reads not so much as a movie, but more like a TV show that has some underlining plots that connect the different episodes, if we were to look at the different chapters as episodes, but could really be independent in many ways too. So that's the gist of it. So I'm going to read the second part of the second chapter, in which these two characters are, as they do, they're wandering through the island, and they run into a Seminole Indian who is looking for an establishment that is now in ruins, and lots of interesting things happen in this process, right? So the title is Hard Rock Live. Pero antes de la autopista, no se sabe por dónde, llegaron los indios seminolas. Me los encuentro cerca de las ruinas de lo que fue la tropical. Sobre las ruinas se ha estado preparando el último concierto, el concierto despedida de todo. No más metal extremo, no más broncas multitudinarias y ebrias al final de la noche, unos muchachos cadavéricos a los que nunca más volveré a ver. Le pegan mandarriazos finales a un escenario de tablones carcomidos. Tengo en mis manos una hoja impresa. Por un lado, el programa musical. Por el otro, la publicidad pirata de la botella de vodka partida a la mitad y con las puntas chorreando sangre. Absolute la tropical. Los seminolas son dos. Un viejo, por las arrugas de su cara puede verse desfilar a toda una tribu en marcha de protesta. Y uno joven, de rostro distraído, al que reconozco inmediatamente. Es el autista disfrazado. Me pregunto, ¿qué está haciendo el autista en compañía de un indio seminola? ¿Y por qué está haciéndose pasar por indio seminola en compañía de un indio seminola que parece auténtico? Al principio, a lo lejos, parecían 4 indios seminolas, pero dos de ellos no eran seminolas, sino subliminales. No se les podía ver el rostro. No daba tiempo. Explicaron que su función era salir en el documental. Ellos simplemente iban a andar por ahí, de un lado a otro, enviando señales imperceptibles a la mente del espectador en forma de pequeñas cápsulas. Pruebe el refresco reggaetone. Vaya al bar de la esquina, pida una lata bien fría de reggaetone y siéntese a compartir con viejos amigos, con amigos extrañables. Comparta con ellos las penas del día de no hacer nada, de nada esperar. Siéntase libre de sentirse cobijado bajo el horizonte del pueblo, el municipio, la provincia, de todos esos lugares donde habrá siempre un refresco reggaetone. Esperando por usted. Consúmalo con moderación, es su responsabilidad. ¿Qué estás haciendo?, le pregunto al autista, que me mira muy serio. Buen amigo, me dirige la palabra el seminola anciano. Estamos buscando el Hard Rock Café y despliega frente a mí, solemne, como si fuera una bandera, un t-shirt del Hard Rock Café Havana, color rojo desteñido. Nosotros venir de muy lejos, entona el autista. Nosotros querer encontrar el Hard Rock Café. El Hard Rock Café ya no existe, le informa el indio, y tu acompañante lo sabe muy bien. Lo demolieron. Mira alrededor. Estamos en plan de remodelación total. El seminola mueve la cabeza, pensativo. Ya veo. También están llenando de piedras el estrecho de la Florida. Inmensas piedras, unas sobre otras, por encima de los cayos. Supongo que forma parte del plan. ¿Qué se esconde detrás de todo esto? ¿Qué se puede esconder?, pregunto. La pregunta es, ¿los hombres caimanes lo tuvieron en cuenta? No sabremos nunca. El Hard Rock Café Havana era nuestra última esperanza de conocimiento. Puedo llevarte al lugar donde estaba, si te sirve de algo contemplar los restos. Buena idea. Tú llevarnos, dice el autista. Quizás encontrar allí lo que nosotros buscar. Tú vienes con él, ¿no?, le digo con una sonrisa, y entonces no hay nada más que hablar. De acuerdo, en marcha. Caminaremos durante muchas lunas. ¿Toda la isla? El seminor reumático se estremece. Es un chiste. No podemos hacer un tour ni aunque quisiéramos. Menos mal, porque estamos agotados. Ya hemos recorrido todo el mundo, o casi. Toda la cadena de restaurantes Hard Rock Café. ¿Qué tiene que ver los seminolas con la cadena Hard Rock Café?, pregunto, desinformado. ¿Bromeas? Hard Rock Café International pertenece a nuestra tribu desde tiempos inmemoriales. Hard Rock Café es la casa de nuestra tribu. ¿Y los hombres caimanes qué son? ¿Una especie de seminolas especializados? Pues puedes verlo así. Fueron el producto de una mutación genética en los Everglades. Sus mandíbulas eran lo bastante fuertes al cerrarse como para aplastar los huesos de animales pequeños, pero tan débiles a la hora de abrirse que era posible impedir que lo hicieran manteniéndolos cerrados con una mano. Apunta el seminol autista, hablándole a la cámara que nos sigue. Ya todos están muertos. No llegamos a conocerlos bien. El hombre que mejor los conoció también está muerto. No era un indio, era un escritor. Su nombre en clave era P.K.D. ¿El autor de ciencia ficción? Pregunto. ¿Pero quién va a ser? Si no hay otro. Sin duda alguna se trata de Philip Kindred Dick, el autor de ciencia ficción, o sencillamente de Philip K. Los autores de ciencia ficción en realidad no sabemos nada. No podemos hablar sobre ciencia ficción porque nuestro conocimiento es limitado y no oficial, y nuestra ficción es lamentable. Dick, el autor. So now and I'm going to read a little bit longer of the English just so that it kind of closes the segment. I just didn't want to go too long in the Spanish, but it'll hopefully give you a little more of an idea of what's going on. So in English, the title, El Hard Rock Life. But before the freeway, nobody knows where from, the Seminole Indians had arrived. I found them near the ruins of what once was La Tropical, over which a concert was being set up. The Farewell to Everything concert. No more extreme metal, no more massive drunk brawls at the end of the night. A couple of emaciated guys I will never see again hammer the final nails into the rotted boards of the stage. I have a concert flyer in my hand. On one side, the musical lineup. On the other, a bootleg vodka ad with a bottle smashed in half, blood dripping from its jagged edges. Absolute La Tropical. There are two Seminoles, an elderly one. You can see the entire tribe marching in protest in his wrinkles, and an expressionless younger one who I recognize immediately. It's El Autista in disguise. I ask myself what El Autista is doing with a Seminole Indian. Why is he pretending to be a Seminole Indian with a Seminole Indian who seems to be authentic? At first, from far away, it looked like there were 4 Indians, but two were subliminals, not Seminoles. You couldn't see their faces. There wasn't enough time. They explained their purpose was to appear in the documentary. They were just passing by, going back and forth, sending hidden messages to viewers in short segments. Try reggaetonic. Go to the corner bar, order a cold can of reggaetonic soda, sit with old friends, with dear friends, share the pain of your idle days, the pain of your hopeless days. Feel free to find comfort in the skyline of your pueblo, your city, your province. Wherever you are, there will always be a refreshing reggaetonic waiting for you. Enjoy it responsibly. What are you doing? I ask El Autista. Who's looking at me solemnly? Good friend, El Seminole, the elderly one, addresses me. We are looking for a Hard Rock Cafe. He unfurls before me, as if it were a flag, a faded red Hard Rock Cafe Havana t-shirt. From very far we come, El Autista intones. We want find. A Hard Rock Cafe no longer exists, I tell the Indian. Your friend knows that very well. They demolished it. Look around. We're in the middle of an extreme makeover. El Autista turns his head thoughtfully. I see. They're also filling the Florida streets with rocks. Huge rocks, one over the next, over the Ks. I suppose that is part of the plan. What is hiding behind all this? What could possibly be hiding, I ask. The question is, did the K-men take this into account? We'll never know. El Hard Rock Cafe Havana was our last hope to understand. I can take you to the place where it once stood if you think contemplating its remains would be helpful. Good idea, you take us, El Autopista says. Perhaps there we find what we seek. You're coming with him, right? I say with a fake smile, and he nods, and then El Seminole nods. There's nothing else to discuss. Okay, let's go. We'll walk for many moons. The entire island? The arthritic Seminole shudders. I'm kidding. We couldn't tour it even if we wanted to. Thank goodness, because we're exhausted. We've already traveled the entire world. Nearly the entire world. We've visited all Los Hard Rock Cafes. What do Seminoles have to do with El Hard Rock Cafe? I asked, uninformed. You're joking, right? El Hard Rock Cafe International has belonged to our tribe since the beginning of time. El Hard Rock Cafe is our tribe's home. And who are the Cayman? A specialist species of Seminole? I suppose you could say that. They were the result of a genetic mutation in the Everglades. Their jaws were strong enough to crush the bones of small animals, but also so weak you could keep them from opening with your hand. El Autista Seminole reports to the camera following us. They're all dead now. We didn't know them very well. The one who knew them best is also dead. He wasn't an Indian. He was a writer. His initials were PKD. A science fiction writer, I ask? Who else could it be? It couldn't be anybody else. Without a doubt, it has to be Philip Kindred Dick, the science fiction writer, or simply Philip K. Science fiction writers, I am sorry to say, really do not know anything. We can't talk about science because our knowledge is limited and unofficial, and usually our fiction is dreadful. Dick, the author. In the mid-1970s, when he was still alive, he was eating at a Chinese restaurant in Yorba, California, the town where Nixon grew up. In his fortune cookie, he got the following fortune. Deeds done in secret have a way of becoming found out. He immediately mailed the slip of paper to the White House, mentioning that the Chinese restaurant was located within a mile of Nixon's original home. I think this is a mistake has been made. By accident, I got Nixon's fortune. Does he have mine? Signed, Philip K. Dick. That poor man, he once said to his wife Tessa, with tears in his eyes, shut up in the darkness, playing the piano in the night to himself, alone and afraid, knowing what's to come. The White House did not answer. The FBI had already stopped responding to his letters. He left the letters from the CIA unopened for fear of miniature atomic bombs. The KGB kept invading his dreams with colorful lights. The Cayman thought, this guy is good. Any little thing would trigger PKD's persecution complex, the Indian recalls. That's why when the Cayman contacted him, he thought they were a secret organization planning to kidnap him. The Cayman did, in fact, function as a secret organization within the Seminole tribe, and due to Philip K. Dick's resistance to meet them, they did kidnap him. They took him away from Los Angeles. I live near Disneyland. He once wrote, they are always adding new rides and destroying old ones. Disneyland is an evolving organism to the swamps of the Everglades. When he saw the monstrous organisms that had captured him, the reptilian humanoids whose skin was covered with hard scales called osteoderms, he closed his eyes and said, a friend of mine once published a book called Snakes of Hawaii. A number of libraries wrote to him ordering copies. Well, there are no snakes in Hawaii. All the pages of his book are blank. I don't think you all exist. You're another one of my hallucinations. You're my blank pages. The Cayman then placed a book in his hands. Philip K. Dick trembled. He sensed he had reached the pinnacle of his nightmare. But when he opened his eyes, he was surprised to see the book was a science fiction novel, one of his favorites. In his opinion, one of the greatest science fiction novels ever written. The novel was Camp Concentration by Thomas Disch, also known as Tom. I have a class theory of literature. I come from the wrong neighborhood to sell the New Yorker. No matter how good I am as an artist, they always can smell where I come from. Disch, Suicide Warrior. always keep a can of Regatonic in the fridge after work to combat the intense heat. Take a cold shower and sit in front of the fan with a Regatonic soda in hand. Think of the Cays brimming with hotels. Think of the hot mulatas and mulattoes swimming, their skins burning. Let the sweat hit the floor like drops of lead. Smile, drink, feel the dizziness dissipate. Feel the tension of your neck melt away. Your head is not going to explode. Harmless if consumed in small sips.
Thank you.
So very bizarre, isn't it? It's kind of intense, but
I love the wordplay, the seminals, subliminals.
mm-hmm. Yeah, he's a bit of a master in that.
Yeah. So you came across quite a bit of that throughout the novel?
Yes, and in a lot of ways, Spanish, the language does that without much help. There were words that, it's not exactly the same thing, but words like gender or género in Spanish, which can be genre and gender. And there's a lot of confusion between many different things. There's confusion between seeing multiple visions, seeing double of many things. And there's a lot of confusion between different categories, between machine and body, between fiction and reality, between what might be a movie and what might be real life. So it's not just in the wordplay, but the seminal and subliminal, and thankfully that worked in both Spanish and English.
Right. So there's a lot of, like you said, you can't really necessarily always tell between fiction and reality. Mm-hmm. And it must be kind of disorienting then throughout the novel. Mm-hmm. And that's...
Absolutely. And in this passage, and of course you didn't see the text, but there were many quotes, direct quotes from things that Philip K. Dick actually said, Thomas Disch, and Nixon and the White House responses. And in this particular chapter, they're quoted, even if they're spliced between the written text, the original novel. But throughout the book, there are many passages that were taken directly from magazines or newspapers or other books and weren't quoted. Mm. And so some were translated into Spanish, some were not. So there was a lot of, it's very disorienting as a reader and as a translator.
Right, and then as the translator, you are having to catch all of those allusions and references, whether they're quoted or not, mm-hmm. and then do the research.
Right. Yes, and some things, something as official as published, like Philip K. Dick's work was fairly easy to find, but there are other things that, there were Wikipedia articles, for example, and it wasn't always clear what he made up, what he quoted directly, or what he quoted and manipulated, what he quoted, manipulated, and translated. And so there was a lot of research. Yes, it was all internet research. It was all Google research. It wasn't necessarily any kind of academic, deep archival research, but a lot of that for sure. Mm-hmm.
And so most of the research that you had to do wasn't necessarily historical, or it wasn't far back in history, right? It was a certain period of time of U.S. pop culture that you were having to research, right?
Yes, and in this case, it's 70s, right? But there were then, I'm trying to think. I think that's probably the oldest, the farthest back I had to go. It was mostly the 90s, which is interesting. Jorge Enrique Lage came of age in the 90s, which was a very strange, disorienting time for Cubans on the island. It was after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, so Soviet Cuba disappears. But it was this special period in times of peace, right? So it was strange. place where geopolitically it was very disorienting. I mean, from a cultural perspective and from a political perspective, and the world didn't know what to do with Cuba either, right? So it was terribly disoriented, and also the U.S. pop culture of the time, mostly it manifests in grunge rock, lots of Nirvana, lots of Courtney Love, and other, Anne Rice and Marilyn Manson and other pop figures come up, and it's interesting that this is a time where this generation and his generation was coming of age, but at the same time, this pop culture was probably not getting to the island. It probably arrived at least 10 years later, right? And everything is a little slower. And even though there wasn't necessarily an Iron Curtain at that time, it was very, very isolated. Right? So, whereas now it's very easy they have free access to the internet. So it was just this very interesting, isolating, disorienting time, right? The 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though this takes place in the mid 21st century, we're very much in the 90s. We're very much in the special period, an alternate special period, but it feels that way.
Mm-hmm. And so with all of the allusions to U.S. pop cultures, and would you say that the Cubans are big consumers of pop culture in the U.S., or is it certain people like Lage who are big consumers?
Yeah, I asked him that, and he was very snarky in his remark, and he said the entire world. He said, U.S. pop culture is global pop culture. We just get it a little later. And of course, even later if you're on the island. So that's true, right? So I don't think that it's very specific to him or to writers of his, quote unquote generation. It is, however, interesting that the kinds of pop culture references that he chose to include, I mean, some are very popular and everybody understands, like Nirvana and Courtney Love, right? And Anne Rice. But then there are others like Buckethead, and there were all these Poppy Z. Bright, all of these figures and movements and trends that I'm exactly his age and came of age in the 90s and had no idea what some of these things were. So very esoteric, really. So I think that is probably more personal to him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And on the back of the book, it says that this novel is haunted by Cuban history. Is it the special period? I mean, is that what that's referring to, or how much of Cuban history plays into this haunting?
I mean, it's all of it. It's Cuban history haunts every corner of personal and public identity. It's impossible to separate Cuban history from the Cuban condition, regardless of whether you're, which side of the Florida Straits you're on. So absolutely. And I think what it grapples with, I mean, of course, the 90s was what he experienced and what is most familiar to us, this isolating and disorienting period. But really, I mean, if we look at the entire Cuba, after colonization, of course, the entirety of Cuban history, there has been this anxiety of both feeling incredibly isolated and not participating in the global scene, and at the same time also feeling like everybody's in their business, right? And the powers du jour are trying to control and intervene, and so there's this terrible tension all the time. And so it's and so I think that that's exactly what this kind of what this novel represents, is that anxiety of being an island, right? And then ceasing to be an island. But this highway destroys that islandness, right? And at the same time, it's probably not net positive. But what's the alternative, right? So there are no real clear answers, and it's disorienting and isolating, right? All at the same time. And they themselves are wandering, right? They themselves are lost. And looking. They're very open to finding, but they're not necessarily tied to a certain outcome, but very much wandering. Yeah.
So we have these two characters, the nameless narrator, or the unnamed narrator, El Autopista, and then the island itself, Cuba, is a character, or at least Havana is in a way a character.
Right, or what's left of it, to quote the book, right? Yes. Well, there's, right, the narrator, and then there's his sidekick, El Autista, which is, of course, this very endearing, or not so endearing, idiosyncratic quirk of Cubans to call people not so nice names in an endearing way, right? And so he's presumably on the spectrum, and so he has these quirky things like talking, like pretending to be a Seminole Indian in this excerpt. But right, so there are these two characters, and maybe they're just one, right? Which is again this idea of the double, and is it two things? Is it one thing? And then of course this Havana presence, right? The presence of the city that's really in shambles, but it's being sacrificed for something modern and great that doesn't really bring anything that exciting at the end of the day. And so, yeah, I mean, the island, the site, right? The sites of the island, and we're mostly in Havana, is very, very much a character.
Going a little bit further into like the translation itself, your translation work. In the novel, we have a lot of English sprinkled throughout. So how did you deal with that in the English version of the novel?
Yeah, that was really tough. And on the surface level, that sort of thing really resists translation. I mean, what do? Do you just make those words Spanish? But that doesn't have the same effect. So I had to really, every case was different. I had to make some sometimes very difficult decisions that it could have gone either way, right? I mean, there's so many possibilities. But just to give you an idea, I mean, these are the names, these are the titles of the chapters: Breaking News, Hard Rock Live, Trans Metal, White Trash, Fast Forward, Hall of Fame, Triple X, Grandmaster, Girls Gone Wild, and The Horror. I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, they're stamped in time, right? Like they're very much anchored in a specific place, the timeline. And so after, the first thing I wrote is, this is going to be challenging on my notes. But I just decided to add the Spanish definite article before these and leave them in English. Because Breaking News, I mean, Hard Rock Live, I mean, there was just no real transmetal, transmetal, it's nothing, right? And so that was the way that I went, that was the decision I made regarding the titles, the chapter titles. And so because, and the way that I justified this is, when you're reading it in English, I'm not sure that necessarily, I mean, Breaking News, there are some words that are loan words and that we use all the time, but in Spanish, but not necessarily these. These definitely have an effect on the reader. And so in order to recreate that effect for the English reader, I decided to make them Spanish, to make them not seem natural and native, but not changing him at the same time. So there was a little bit of discomfort and disorientation in that, in the same way that I perceived the Spanish reader, the Spanish language reader would relate to it.
So could you read a couple of those as you translated them, with the definite article?
Oh, sure.
A couple of the titles?
Yeah, sure. So last breaking news, El Hard Rock Live, El Transmetal, La White Trash, El Fast Forward, El Hall of Fame, La XXX, and El Grand Master, Last Girls Gone Wild, El Horror. So I guess I had the definite article that I chose agrees with what that noun would have been in Spanish. So news, noticias, las breaking news. So if it's possible to make that agree, that's what I was going for.
Interesting. So what about some other specific challenges that you came up with in the translation process? Something that you really struggled with, and how did you resolve it?
So, well, I mean, going back to the language, there were some other, the English, Spanish, there were some other words throughout that I decided to either leave in Spanish or add a different word in Spanish. Maybe not that exact word.
Words that were originally in English.
In English
Okay.
here.
Mm-hmm.
I may have left in English in the translation, but I maybe created a different, or I added a Spanish word somewhere else just to try to simulate that effect. One thing that I struggled with was there's a Mexican at some point who works in the construction site and guides the narrators. And he has a Mexican accent, and he uses Mexican words that a Cuban would never use. And so when you're reading it in Spanish, there's definitely this, does not seem natural. And so what I ended up doing was keeping those Mexican words so that it would signify to the reader there's something different here that doesn't sound like the other characters.
Mm-hmm.
So that was difficult to think of, or that was challenging. Another one, and this is just bizarre, but there's this one scene where they're in this trash, what do you call it, a landfill. And the landfill, of course, it can't just be a regular landfill. It has some radioactivity, and then there's marijuana that's growing that, of course, is radioactive and does things, right? And there are these Rastas, so these Jamaicans who are walking around, and instead of dreads, or their dreads rather, are snakes. So thinking of a Medusa, but they're snakes, but they're dreads. And the way that one of these Rastas gets high is by feeding the snakes this radioactive marijuana. And so there's this, there's a scene, and they're just having this exchange, and they start talking about starting a business, and the business should be journals, like journals you write in. And it just gets really wild and crazy. And I just had no idea what it was really saying in Spanish. And I just didn't. But if it doesn't make any sense in Spanish, it shouldn't make any sense in English. And so I just decided that they're high, and it's not supposed to make any sense in any language. And hopefully that comes across. So yeah, I mean, so that was interesting. And then going back to the language just is probably the most challenging bit. There's a conversation at some point later on in El Grand Master, that chapter. The narrator is playing chess with the Apple from Apple, right? The computer, Apple Macintosh. So this Apple is alive and it's playing chess. And there are these two commentators that appear. And the commentators are Capablanca, right, who is the great Cuban chess player, and Bobby Fischer. And so in the original, Bobby Fischer is sometimes speaking in English, and Capablanca is obviously speaking in Spanish. And then at some point, Capablanca says something in English, and Bobby Fischer starts speaking in Spanish. So that was really tough. And in the first few drafts that I submitted, I kept all of the Spanish for Capablanca, and I kept everything in English for Bobby Fischer. And the notes were that it was too much Spanish for the English reader, and that was true. And so what I ended up doing was keeping a few phrases in Spanish, but translating most of Capablanca's, because it didn't have the same effect to have that bilingual conversation in the English translation. So that was kind of bizarre. And a lot of that was quoted directly from things that Bobby Fischer said in many different places, not just in one source, which was also interesting. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So the section where the Rastas were talking about their journals or diaries or whatever, that made no sense in Spanish. Would you consider that like a moment of untranslatability?
Based on my experience, yes, but that's probably not universally true. I mean, it was just very difficult. So, I mean, were the words untranslatable? I hope not. I would like to think that the effect was translatable, but right. I mean, at the surface level, maybe.
Okay.
It was very challenging.
Is there anything that you would consider untranslatable in this novel, and how did you resolve it, or how did you get around it?
I mean, other than that specific section, which is very short. I mean, it's not even a whole paragraph. I wouldn't say that anything. It's a very straightforward. I mean, for as bizarre as it is, and it really is all over the place. It is very accessible in Spanish. And so I really didn't get that sense other than these words in English, right? And again, I don't think that that's untranslatable. I mean, there's a workaround.
Right.
But I don't think so, really. Yeah.
So I'm curious about why not just translate those titles, the chapter titles, into Spanish in the English?
Well, because Girls Gone Wild.
It's
Does
too
that
specific.
mean it's too specific? I mean, it's a proper noun, right? Hall of Fame is not that bizarre in Spanish, so that makes sense.
But is there an equivalent Hall of Fame in Spanish?
Sure, but what would it? But it wouldn't have the same effect for the English reader, right? As Hall of Fame. I mean, Hall of Fame is big stuff, right?
Yeah.
When you hear it, and as a Spanish speaker, you hear it, it makes total sense. I don't know that would have the same effect in English, so that's why I decided not to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
For these specific ones, yeah.
Interesting. So, before we open up to the audience, is there anything I should have asked but didn't?
I mean, it's just no. The book really, as I see it, right? It was a very personal choice to translate this book, because in a lot of ways, I feel very disoriented in my identity and in my human condition, and so I felt like this was really telling my story in a very indirect way, and so I think it's important, at least as I see it, as the daughter of Cuban refugees and having grown up in an exile enclave, I strongly feel that this kind of narrative really represents the Cuban condition, or conditions really, because there are many, but that's really what I would have to say, is that it really is, it's very personal, but it's also very national, and for both, I would argue, for both sides of the island, this is a common experience.
What was the reaction to the book in Cuba, the original?
It won many awards, and it was very well respected. And of course, the publishing in Cuba is difficult because of they don't have the resources to physically publish books. And so thankfully now with digital work, it's easier to share things. But so it was, most books get published in Spain or Mexico. In this case, it was actually, there's a US editor or publishing house that published it. But I mean, it was originally published in Cuba, but then it was also published abroad. So it was very well received.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you. And like to open up to questions now.
Savro.
Thank you very much for your reading or presentation. My question is, if you have your book in front of you, both in English and Spanish, and if you want to read it for yourself, which one will you prefer to read?
If I were to read, like if I wanted to read it,
Yeah, for yourself.
it's a very interesting question because I feel that neither one of those languages are my native tongue, right? I feel like I don't have a native tongue. So translation is it. So I would probably go back and forth in earnest. That's a really interesting question.
So you will take both books?
I'd have to. I really have to. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Lourdes, can you tell us a little more about the process of getting it published? Like, at what point did you reach out to the author? How did this take place from when you decided?
Yes. Well, I was actually on a writer's retreat with Shelby, and I was looking for a book, or actually, I was looking for a text, a short story, a contemporary short story that my students could read for a class that I was teaching on national identity and literature in Spanish America. And I wanted to find something that didn't have an English translation so that my students would have to read it in Spanish. And so I found a story of his, a short story of Jorge Enrique Lage. And I was really intrigued, and then I kept reading more about it as I prepared for my students, for my lesson plan. And then I came across this novel. And the more I read, the more I just thought, this is something that I need to translate for myself. And then I reached out to George Hinson, who was our classmate here, and he knows everybody and has everybody's email. So I emailed him for Jorge Enrique's contact, and within an hour I had it. And then emailed Jorge Enrique, and he gave me permission to translate. And then I reached out to Deep Vellum, and they accepted it. And I make it sound really simple, but this was very many years in the making and in the process of just getting all that taken care of. So that was a very abbreviated history, but that's how it worked. It was pretty seamless. Many thanks to George Hinson, who gave me his contacts, because it's not easy to find. I mean, it's getting easier now with social media, but it wasn't back then, or I wouldn't have thought to look at. No, because it wasn't as open, so I don't know that they would have had social media access. So it would be hard unless you had a personal contact. It would have been hard to reach him, or much harder anyway.
I wanted to ask you something very specific about the reptilian human and the snakes and all this. Like, how do you see that in the novel? Why is there this interest in the?
Well, it's probably important to mention that he is a biochemist, Jorge Enrique Lage. So he has a science degree. And so and in fact, there are several explanations here that are very scientific, and I had to really try to understand what those meant. But so what is the significance that they just come up in this one chapter? And this is actually another decision that I had to make. In the Spanish, they are called, what are they called? Hombres Caimanes, right? Hombres Caimanes, and I translated them to Caimen, CAIMEN. So that was a choice I had to make, because I didn't want to be. I didn't really think that there were any other good options, but they just come up in this one moment. This lost, like, we call it lost link. Hidden. There's just this gap in this trajectory of evolution, I suppose, and so there were these humanoids that had secrets. I guess they were proto-Seminoles, and they had the secrets of of the Seminole tribe. And for whatever reason, Philip K. Dick had whatever they left behind, that, and we're not sure what it was. It could have been a book, maybe not. And they're looking for this artifact that explains the origins or just important information about the tribe, about the Seminole tribe. And so because they are no longer, and Philip K. Dick has died, and we don't have this artifact, the tribe is in great danger of perhaps extinction or is in some sort of danger. And so but that's it. It's just they show up in this chapter, they don't find it, there's no resolution. And of course, I mean, we could speculate what this could mean. I mean, there's this incredible exodus from the island that left. There's this huge gap in so much, right? In cultural history and family history that the island has suffered throughout the 20th century, really. And so many things that will never be known because of that separation. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we could look at it that way. But really, they're not terribly significant beyond this chapter. And even in this chapter, they're not. They're just one.
But that was another fun instance of wordplay.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because hombres caimanes and then men,
Mm-hmm.
which are caimans who are like men, right?
Right.
Caiman being the alligator type kind of creature.
Right. And of course, Ks are little keys, like little islands.
Yeah.
And so, right. And I did something similar too in, what chapter was that? That was Transmetal, I believe. Transmetal. There's this moment where this Mexican character comes in, and he's sent to a lab in Mexico to harness the DNA of hurricanes, right? And so there's this crazy underground lab with this mad scientist who invites him to do this because he's brilliant, and they can only harness the DNA of of hurricanes with female names. For whatever reason, the ones who are named after men, it doesn't work. They can't harness this. And so this Mexican character is supposed to fix this problem. And instead he falls in love with the mad scientist's daughter and has to flee. And that's why he's now in Cuba building the highway. And so in the meantime, of course, he runs away, and the lab harnesses the DNA of what we come to find out is Katrina, but she manifests as this colossal woman who looks like Courtney Love. And then in the original, she's called Mujer Huracán, and I translated it to Hussy Cane. It could have also been Hurricane. And I just went back and forth so many times. At one point, I just closed my eyes and picked one because there's so many decisions. So that was another fun one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I enjoyed translating.
Other questions?
I may have missed this, but did they ever, the idea of the highway, did they ever talk about the engineers? Were they particular nationality? Do we get any kind of?
There's this possible, I mean, it sort of alludes to maybe the US building it, perhaps. There are workers. There's a point where in that Transmetal chapter where there are basically migrant workers from the Pan-Caribbean, right? Just from all over the Caribbean come and work. And of course they're low-income workers, right? Who are doing the grunt work and physically building.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see if there was anything that was overtly political or post-colonial or.
At one point, when this Hussy Cane, when this woman hurricane that looks like Courtney Love, comes up, the Americans send helicopters to try to bring her down. And of course she swats at them and they die. So there is a point where there's a fast food restaurant that turns into a sex shop that's really a front for an illegal gambling room in the back. And it is run by the Miami Mafia. And of course, there are all these legends of, the Miami Mafia infiltrating Cuba and this legends of, Castro's Mafia infiltrating Miami and all this stuff. So that's the most overtly political,
Interesting.
possibly, yeah.
But not all that important, evidently, in
Yeah,
that whole scheme
yeah.
of things.
And the building of the highway is the building of the Great Wall of China is paralleled with the building of the highway. In fact, there's a huge section that quotes Kafka directly, the Great Wall, Kafka's Great Wall. So it's all over. It's all over the place. It makes Cuba a very global experience.
Yeah.
It is in some ways and also terribly not in others, right?
Mm-hmm.
So very complicated in that sense.
Well, if there are no other questions, I guess we can go ahead and close here. Thank you for
Thank
being
you.
here.
Thank you all. Thank you.